Hey everyone. So this is a lecture designed to keep us on track with where we want to be on the syllabus and to cover the material that we had hoped to cover before the midterm exam. So you can watch this at your leisure, but this will be material that ends up on the midterm, and it is included on your study guide. And if you have questions about this, feel free to stop by office hours, shoot me an email, or we have a whole class that's just dedicated to review for the midterm exam, and so we can talk about some of these things if you have questions then. Today's lecture is going to focus on the Maine executive branch. We've talked a lot about the legislative branch, but we haven't yet gone into the governor, their office, the powers and responsibilities that they have, and the role that they play in state policy. And so we're going to talk about that. We'll start with the historical evolution of the office of governor in Maine, how it has changed over time, and I think you'll see become more powerful and a more significant force in Maine state politics. Then we'll move on to talk about the many roles that the governor plays in state government currently. We'll talk about the fairly vast administrative apparatus that is under control of the governor, the state bureaucracy, various agencies and entities that actually carry out policy in the state. And then we're going to talk about some of the structural changes to Maine's state bureaucracy over time. So we'll start with history, the office of the governor throughout history. What you'll notice immediately when you read about Maine's history is that the office of governor has changed pretty dramatically. So we have to go all the way back to Maine's independence, Maine's early statehood, breaking off from Massachusetts in 1820, and look at the governor there. And what you see is something that looks radically different than the office that we have today. So first off, the governor served a one-year term, and we cycled through governors pretty significant ways. Somebody wouldn't hang on for years and years and years. They would serve one term and then move on. And the majority of governors were coming not from populated areas, but small towns and rural areas. They were from the outskirts of communities in Maine. And they had virtually no staff. Today, it's still the case that the legislature has a larger staff than the governor's office and a larger administrative budget, I think by about 8-1. But when we go back to early statehood and the office of the governor at that time, there was virtually no staff. It was almost, like a single person operation. But they also had a lot less to do. There was significantly less work for them to undertake and fewer roles that were clearly laid out for them to play. So it made sense that they had fewer staff. And where we really see this is how policy was administered. So today, and we'll be talking about this a little bit later, but today we have the Department of Education, Department of Transportation, Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. All of those entities have commissioners, heads that report to the governor. In the early stages of Maine statehood, a lot of those administrative and executive roles were carried out by quasi-independent boards and councils that sprung up as needs arose. And the governor did not have any sort of authority or control over them. So policy, the execution of policy, the administration of policy was somewhat diffuse, and there wasn't a single individual like the governor to coordinate it all. So they would deliberate on policy issues and craft, practice and kind of procedures without any coordination from the governor. So they didn't actually have a lot of control over the actual administration of policy. The result for a long time was that even though today we talk about the citizen legislature that we have in Maine being the most powerful body in Maine state politics, at this point, in the early decades of Maine statehood, it was even more powerful. And it took decades before the governor's office had any meaningful control over the day-to-day operations of Maine public policy. We've seen over time, particularly in the last 30 or 40 years, the office of governor in the state of Maine start to look like the office of governor in other states, and there's been this convergence in terms of what the governor's responsibility is. really nationally, from one state to another. But that took a long time in Maine, and actually involved changes to the Constitution, involved dramatic political changes, and it wasn't immediate. And it's only really in the last 30 or 40 years that we've started to see the governor have significant policy control. So what were some of those important changes? Well, first off, in 1841, through a constitutional amendment, we shifted to a 2-year term, which is significant. If you're trying to put your mark on policy and actually have an impact on what's going to happen in the state, it's easier to do so in 2 years than it is 1 year. But really, it isn't until the mid-20th century that we see something really significant happen. And that's the election of Ed Muskie, who's kind of a legendary figure in Maine state politics. Prior to this point, so Muskie was a Democrat, and would go on to be, a senator and a presidential candidate, and is, like I said, he's a legend in Maine state politics. But his election as a Democrat broke this basically 100-year period of Republican control over Maine state politics. Basically, since the Republican Party had been, a modern political party in the United States, it had had pretty significant control, both over who served as governor and then also control in the legislature. But Ed Muskie, he worked to build support in areas that had traditionally not been well represented in Maine state politics. So prior to his election, it was really a powerful set of business interests that the Republican Party represented, and a certain kind of cultural conservatism that they represented. And Ed Muskie brought new voices into the process and was able to build a coalition of support that enabled him to win a statewide race, and really created a space in which we have something like what we have today, where there's Republicans, Democrats, and then a significant number of independents. Prior to that, we didn't have a competitive party system. And so now you have space for Democratic governors who are going to have a more urban base of support. Ed Muskie was building support in places like Portland and Lewiston and Bangor, whereas previously state politics had really catered to the rural regions, the outskirts of the state. In 1957, we saw a shift to the 4-year term that we now have today for the office of governor, and that again happened through constitutional amendment. And then in 1971, this sounds less significant than it is, but Maine shifted away from that system of boards and councils, that decentralized system of policy administration, to a cabinet system of policy administration, which meant that the governor had a central role in coordinating and providing oversight for the implementation of policy. So that's what we know today, right, where the governor appoints someone to run the Department of Health and Human Services, or the Department of Education, or the Department of Transportation, and they have a cabinet that's made up of those people, and they meet on a regular basis. And there's a lot within state politics that is at the discretion of the executive branch. It's not specifically codified in law, and so through that cabinet, the governor can exert their control. There was something prior to 1975 called the Executive Council, and this is interesting. It's an interesting footnote in the history of Maine state politics. The Executive Council was essentially an oversight body that, what did they oversee? They oversaw the governor. It would be comprised of people, usually former legislators or legislators who had lost their seats in the previous election, and they essentially acted as a check against the executive branch. They would provide oversight for the governor's office. And that's really going to limit dramatically what the governor can do if they have to answer to this executive council. And so that was eliminated in 1975 through a referendum. And so it's only, by 1975 that the power of the governor's office starts to look something like it does today. It's really recent in historical terms. So characteristics of Maine governors. There's almost always some form of past policy experience. Frequently what we see is individuals rise up through the state legislature before they even contemplate a run for governor. Paul LePage is somewhat of an exception in that he never ran for legislature and never served as a legislator. He was mayor of Waterville. That was really the extent of his policy experience. Lots of experience in the business world, right? But that's the atypical path for a Maine governor. Usually it's some time spent in the state legislature and frequently in the leadership of the state legislature. So Speaker of the House, President of the Senate, majority leader, minority leader, some sort of position in leadership frequently is the platform to contemplate a run for office for governor. We have talked in the legislature about how there's a wide range of occupations represented, and it's a little bit less varied for the governor's office. Frequently what we see is a background in law, sometimes in business, sometimes in a mixture of both, but oftentimes we're talking about individuals who have gone to school for law and have practiced law. And oftentimes what we see is individuals who leave the governor's office then use that as a platform to run for office at the federal level. So we've had a number of Maine senators who have emerged from the governor's office, including one of our current Maine senators, Angus King. Sometimes House, sometimes the path is from the governor's office to a House seat. It's the case with Brennan. Sometimes it could be ambassadorships. So we have had individuals who ran for governor and then were ambassadors to other countries. And sometimes they just parlay that experience into either work as lobbyists or for national policy organizations. And that's the case with both Governor Brennan and our governor immediately preceding Paul LePage, John Baldacci, who works now as a DC lobbyist, or at least has until very recently. So those are the characteristics we tend to see in Maine governors. We have not had a female governor in the state of Maine. We've had some female candidates, a number of them, and have some more female candidates for governor in this 2018 gubernatorial election, but we have yet to have a female Maine governor. All right, so roles of the governor. What does the governor do? The answer is quite a lot, and certainly more than they did when we go back to the period of early statehood, and the role of governor was largely this ceremonial role without a lot of power. So first and foremost, they are the head of state. They would represent the state of Maine in any sort of formal proceedings. They are a ceremonial head of state, but they also have formal powers associated with being the head of state. They're head of the military. They oversee the Maine National Guard and can make important decisions about when the Maine National Guard is called upon. The governor appoints someone called the Adjutant General, which is the kind of formal head of the Maine National Guard. And so they are head of the military to the extent that we have a military at the state level. But that's an important role as well. Moving into policy, they're a legislative and policy leader. They have the power to submit bills to the legislature, the governor does. And some of you, as you've been doing research on the legislative advocacy assignment, have probably seen things marked governor's bill. Those are pieces of legislation introduced by the office of the governor. They're introduced on behalf of the governor by legislators, but they have the ability to actually introduce policy and to try to lobby legislators to pass that policy. And they lay out policy initiatives. We just recently had the State of the State. The State of the State, it's specified in the Constitution, the Maine State Constitution, that this needs to happen. But for a long time, it was just a written document that the Maine governor would submit to the legislature. It only recently became an address that would happen annually and be televised and broadcast on the radio. And that's really where the governor lays out what their policy initiatives are. So in the most recent State of the State, Governor Paul LePage was laying out what he wants to get accomplished in his last year in office. And he's going to need legislative support in order to do that. There is, I think, there's a notion that the executive branch and the legislative branch, that there's some sort of strict separation between them. And that's a little bit problematic. Oftentimes, there's very close coordination between the governor's office and his party, the Republican leadership, about what aspects of legislation the governor is willing to support, what types of bills the governor would veto if they came across his desk, what sorts of amendments or changes they want to see on existing legislation. And the closest area in which we see coordination is over the budget. So the governor is chief administrator and creator of the budget. We have a whole lecture that just delves into the minutia of the budget process, but to just quickly lay it out, the initial draft of the biennial budget that funds every aspect of operations requiring government expenditure in the state of Maine is drafted by the governor's office in consultation with their staff and with the heads of various government agencies. So they get to craft the first draft of the biennial budget for the state of Maine, which can set priorities in very important ways. If it's something that the legislature is willing to work with the governor on, then they essentially get to set the agenda for what the state's spending priorities are. That's a pretty significant role. They also have a more informal role as party leader. So as the most prominent statewide elected office, the governor is going to represent their party and be consulted about what the vision is for the party, what the platform is, what their priorities are in terms of getting policy passed, passing pieces of legislation, what sorts of changes they want to see happen in the state while they're in a position of power. A role that's used slightly less frequently now is that the governor traditionally has had this role as kind of an ombudsman. And there is always some element of the governor's calendar that is dedicated to meeting with constituents and hearing their concerns. That has shifted more to appearing at public events, meeting with individuals out in their respective communities. But it used to be the case that citizens would actually bring their concerns to the Blaine House, or they would bring their concerns to the governor's office within the state capitol, and he would hear them out and then attempt to act upon them. Although that's kind of antiquated at this point. There's lots of various entities in state government that exist to hear citizen complaints and concerns, and it's no longer strictly the role of the governor. They also have the ability to formally appoint individuals to just an array, literally hundreds of state boards and commissions. So there's lots of things in the state of Maine. This could be boards that exist to oversee licensure for various professions. It could be just an array of different boards and commissions that oversee various aspects of whatever it might be in the state that are formally appointed by the governor. So they have that role as well. That's a little bit of a legacy to that previous period we had before a cabinet system existed, before a lot of the functions of government became more centralized. But we still have quite a few state boards and commissions that the governor oversees. So that's a lot. That is a tremendous amount of work that the governor does. The governor is not super well paid by comparative perspective. They're paid a really low salary. It's, I think, about $75,000 a year. And you compare other similar states, even in the region, and they make more money than that. And it's a demanding job. It's a demanding job. You're the focus of a lot of scrutiny. You can be the focus of a lot of controversy. Certainly that is the case with Paul LePage. He has taken a lot of heat for different decisions he's made, different statements he's made, and increasingly in a social media environment in which it seems as if every off-the-cuff statement is captured for posterity and used politically. That's an environment in which Paul LePage has frequently been in the hot seat for comments he's made that have been inflammatory or have been critical, particularly of legislators, specific legislators or figures in Maine state politics. both in other parties and within his own. He's clashed with members of the Republican Party as well. So those are the traditional roles of the Maine governor. Let's talk a little bit about state administration. So one of the things that I've said at numerous points is that we have shifted over the last 40 years or so to a system in which we have various state agencies, the commissioners of which are appointed by the governor. And you see some examples here: Maine Department of Transportation, DHHS, Department of Defense, Maine Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, Department of Labor, Department of Corrections. All told, there's 16 different agencies that have commissioners that answer directly to the governor and who are appointed by the governor. And this is one of the key vehicles by which the governor's policy priorities end up actually being carried out. This is, the mechanism by which the governor's policy priorities are executed. So as we said, prior to 1971, many of the critical tasks of implementing laws and then oversight were carried out by these independent boards and commissions. So by the time Muskie was elected in the 1950s, there were over 100. And I believe by the time they made this change in 1971, there were over 300. So this would have been things like, various boards related to public health, various boards related to the environment and environmental protection, just an array of different entities that have been collapsed into this more streamlined system that we have now. And that can be problematic on a lot of levels. One is an issue of lack of coordination. So there's lots of agencies and administrators, and it was certainly the case that there were overlapping responsibilities and jurisdiction. So when you have a decentralized system like this, it can be good, it can be potentially more responsive, more nimble, but it becomes difficult to determine whose lane is whose. And frequently people will kind of drift over into each other's lanes. So one of the reasons why we shifted to this cabinet system was an attempt to streamline this, make it a little more clear who was in charge of what, and to clearly delineate responsibilities and jurisdiction. There's also cost, right? So if you have all of these different entities overseeing things, there's certain fixed costs for any agency. You think about any time a business kind of consolidates its operations and tries to streamline things. And even think about what's happening at the University of Maine right now. They're trying to decrease their footprint and close some buildings and sell some buildings. And one of the reasons they're doing that is that there's certain fixed costs for any given agency. So you need support staff, you need, office space and everything that comes with that, electricity, heat, etc. And so by streamlining this, you can kind of reduce some of those costs, reduce some of those fixed costs. Maine's cabinet style administration is interesting. It places basically all executive state functions within state agencies and executive branch departments, right? So the departments are headed by commissioners who serve at the pleasure of the governor. The governor will nominate someone to serve as a commissioner, and then they are approved by the state senate. And you have some examples there, right? You have some examples of the different state agencies. All of these commissioners are going to meet weekly at cabinet meetings with the governor, and so you have kind of a base of operations, a centralized base in which, if something is happening in the Department of Transportation that potentially has an environmental impact, right, you bring those individuals together. If something in the Department of Health and Human Services is happening that carries over to the Department of Labor, say there's some proposed change to how unemployment benefits are going to be administered. Well, that crosses over a couple different areas of state government. And so by having all these commissioners in the same room, the hope is that you end up with a more responsive, more dynamic, more streamlined system of administering policy. It's really about coordination. It's about centralizing control in a way that enables state agencies to talk to one another and collaborate and be aware of what each other is working on. So the hope is, the benefit would be streamlining, efficiency, a less wasteful use of resources, and that this prevents silos. Silos meaning, two different entities, two different aspects of state government are dealing with the same issue, but they're not communicating with one another. Their efforts are siloed. Okay, so if you look at state spending for Maine, this is from 2016. This more or less aligns with some of those different areas. We see education, welfare, and healthcare take up a significant portion of the budget. Probably the state agency that deals with the most resources, just in terms of the general fund, where budget funds come from, is the Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Education being a close second. So those two agencies in particular are very, very important. And who heads up those agencies, if there's a change in who is heading up those agencies for the governor, that tends to be an item of statewide news. People are interested in that. That's how much these different agencies have at their disposal in terms of resources. But you see other areas too that carry over to different state agencies. But the biggies are Department of Education, Department of Health and Human Services, to a certain extent Department of Transportation, because we do get a lot of federal funding for transportation, but the two big ones are Health and Human Services and Education. One of the questions that we frequently encounter in Maine state politics is whether or not the current configuration of these different agencies and departments is the right one, and whether or not it could be rearranged, consolidated, changed in some significant way. And so we have seen really in both of the most recent governors an effort to change and revamp things. So we see this from the left and the right. Paul LePage is obviously a conservative. John Baldacci was a liberal. And they tend to frame it in different ways. Conservatives, when they set about reorganizing state agencies and departments, will frame it as streamlining, cutting inefficiency and waste, saving the taxpayers money. Liberals tend to frame it as improving mission, better policy outcomes, in some way serving the public better. They're not as interested in framing it in terms of cost cutting, although sometimes they'll do that too. And so I'll just give you a couple examples so that you understand the ways in which this, even though we have this cabinet style system and it's unlikely that we'll change from this system, we still do see reconfiguration and redrawing of some of these boundaries in interesting ways. So under Baldacci in 2004, we actually saw a consolidation. It was pretty significant. It used to be the case prior to 2004 that we had something called the Maine Department of Human Services, and then we had something called the Maine Department of Behavioral and Developmental Services. And both of those departments had pretty significant responsibilities and a lot of budget dollars flowing to them. But they deal in kind of similar and overlapping areas, right? Human Services was largely dealing with health and disability payments, things like that. Department of Behavioral and Developmental Services was more on the mental health side, mental health treatment, rehabilitation, addiction, things like that. And under Baldacci, they were consolidated into the very large Department of Health and Human Services, which in terms of just general fund dollars from the state budget is a huge percentage of the money that Maine spends every year. So that was a very significant shakeup. There, the goal was to streamline things, but also to have two agencies that were dealing in similar areas to be in closer communication with one another. We saw some significant changes under LePage as well. Prior to 2011, we had the Maine Department of Conservation and the Maine Department of Agriculture, and that was collapsed into a single department, the Maine Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. Paul LePage also saw his role as to eliminate redundancy and to get rid of things that he viewed as unnecessary. And so we did see, we used to have something in the state of Maine called the State Planning Office, and what they did was engage in long-term strategic economic planning for the state. What will be the priorities of the state? Where should the state invest? Where does the state want to be in 20 years or 30 years or 10 years? And so they would just kind of produce these these reports and coordinate with different state agencies and with the legislature regarding the vision for what the state would be. Basic kind of policy planning. And Paul LePage did away with that office, got rid of that office, reshuffled its responsibilities to some other existing state agencies. There were also some things that Paul LePage proposed doing that never came to fruition. One of the things that he has proposed for a long time probably won't happen now, but it was a significant objective of his when he was initially elected. He talked about it on the campaign trail, and he would periodically talk about it at various points while he was governor, was collapsing the Maine community college system and the University of Maine system into a single board, right, into a single entity that would oversee both, the UMaine system and the community colleges. That faced a lot of resistance. A lot of the individuals that serve on such boards are politically connected, powerful people, some of whom who have been appointed by previous governors who are not Republicans. And it also faced resistance from the institutions themselves. The University of Maine, the community colleges, saying we have functionally different roles. We exist to do very different things and have different responsibilities. And to simply collapse us into a single board of higher education doesn't make sense. So that would have involved probably some support from the legislature, which Paul LePage was not able to get. So that was one of his proposals that never came to fruition. But the point is, every time there's a change in the governor, one of the things that could happen is change in these executive agencies and the ways in which they're folded into one another, their different mandates and responsibilities. So some final thoughts, just to kind of wrap this up. I would say that one thing that you can take away from this is that the Maine governor has more power and prominence today than at any point in Maine's history. It is still the case that the legislature is supreme in the state of Maine, and if the legislature chooses to, just kind of bypass the governor, and they can get the support to override the governor's vetoes and to essentially circumvent their institutional role, then they can do so. But the Maine governor is powerful, and certainly more powerful than a couple hundred years ago, or even 30 or 40 years ago. What's crucial, though, is that the governor uses that power, how they use that power and their relationship with other branches has important impacts on policy and the character of Maine politics. So the governor has power, but they have to build relationships, and they have to utilize that power in ways that enable them to move forward. If they try to simply act unilaterally, then they're probably not going to be successful. They don't have that degree of power. One of the things that we've seen under Governor Paul LePage is some of those existing efforts at relationship building, some of those existing efforts at really using the governor's office as a platform for persuasion have broken down. He's not necessarily interested in persuasion. He's more interested in kind of the a more confrontational style of politics, right? And there's limits to that. I think that's what we've learned with Paul LePage, is that there's limits to that. There was one year we mentioned the budget, the role that the governor plays in the budget process, which we're going to talk about more in the next lecture. But there was one year in which Paul LePage, in an act of frustration with the legislature, simply said he's not going to submit a budget. He's not going to submit the draft. And the legislature just worked around him that year. There's been various instances in which Paul LePage hasn't been able to achieve what he wants because he's not the consummate politician. He's not a bridge maker, a bridge builder. He's not interested in that. He wants people to do what he wants them to do. And so there's limits to that. The office of the governor can be bypassed. It can be circumvented. And arguably, Paul LePage would have gotten more of what he wanted if he'd been willing to build relationships and work with people in the legislature. But that's not really his style, right? And so we've seen ways in which personality type, leadership style, it plays an important role in what a governor is able to get done. With all that said, it's remarkable what Paul LePage has been able to get done in his almost 8 years in office. people that were dismissive and said that Paul LePage didn't have a vision, he wasn't going to accomplish a lot. I think he's accomplished an awful lot, but he's done so in a different way, and he's done so in a way that is not really congruent with what has typically been done in Maine politics. So that's kind of final thoughts on where we are and what the office of Maine governor has become. It's also just a really interesting year. If I were you, I'd be following what's happening in the gubernatorial race closely, because we are going to elect another governor, and the question is, to what extent has our expectations around the governor's office changed as a result of these 8 years with a very different sort of governor, a very different leadership style. So we'll wrap up there. There is one more video lecture I'm going to put together on the state budget, which is an area in which the legislature and the various state agencies under the control of the governor and the governor's office all come into contact with one another, and they either dance a glorious dance that gets us a state budget that funds state government, or they don't, and we can have a budget shutdown, which is what happened last year. So there's a few selections, one from Palmer just about the kind of nuts and bolts of the budget process, and then some more recent stuff, one from or a couple short 2-page pieces from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and then just a rundown of what happened in 2017 with the budget shutdown by BDN political reporter Chris Cousins. So go ahead and read that material, and then go ahead and watch the video on the state budget process. Thanks very much.